The Apothecary's Window. Part 1. The Scent of Lavender and Loss. Some say Bellewood only appears to those who've lost their way. A village of lantern light and lavender fields where old houses seem to breathe, and the windows hold quiet stories of those who once leaned close to the glass, searching for something more. This is the story of a woman who came to Bellewood not to be found, but to remember what it means to live. Her name was Margaret Hale, although most people called her Meg. She was 27 years old, and already she felt impossibly older, like someone who had lived an entire lifetime in the space of a few short years. Her husband, Thomas Hale, had been her best friend for as long as she could remember. They grew up together in the same small village, ran barefoot across orchard fields in summer, and passed notes behind the pews of the little country church. As they grew older, friendship bloomed into something richer, steady, and warm as the hearth fire Thomas built in the first home they shared. They married at 22. It wasn't the sort of love that burns wildly and fades. It was the kind that roots itself deep in two souls, twining like ivy until it's impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. When Thomas fell ill the following winter, some sudden cruel fever that no doctor could name, Meg nursed him night and day, but by spring, he was gone. The house felt empty without him. The air felt thin, and Meg felt as though some vital thread had been cut, leaving her drifting in a world that made no sense without Thomas there to share it. She languished for many years in that state. One day, she received a letter from her Aunt Martha. Meg hadn't spoken to her Aunt Martha in many years and didn't know if she was still alive or what had become of her. The letter read, "My dear Meg, if you can, come to Bellewood. The shop will need a caretaker soon, and you'll need something to tend beyond your grief. This village, it has a way of mending what the world unravels. Your aunt, Martha Ashford." And so, Meg packed what few belongings she cared to keep and took the stagecoach to Bellewood. The village greeted her with quiet grace. Lanterns swayed gently over the square, their warm light spilling onto snow-dusted cobblestones. The apothecary stood at the corner of the square, a crooked little building with a bay window that seemed to glow faintly in the dusk. Painted in careful lettering above the door were the words, "Ashford's Remedies and Tonics." Meg hesitated at the threshold, her fingers brushing the iron latch. She didn't know the first thing about herbs, tinctures, and salves. But she knew she couldn't stay in the life she'd left behind, a life filled with echoes of Thomas's laughter and the hollow silence that followed. The shop smelled of lavender and sage. Wooden shelves lined the walls, crowded with glass jars filled with dried herbs in shades of green and gold. Bundles of rosemary and thyme hung from ceiling beams, their fragrance mingling with the faint scent of beeswax from the candles in the window. A long oak counter stretched across the room, its surface worn smooth by years of careful hands measuring powders and grinding roots. Behind the counter stood a tall cabinet with tiny drawers, each labeled in Aunt Martha's looping script: comfrey, feverfew, valerian, angelica. Meg set down her small suitcase and let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The shop felt alive somehow, not bustling, but breathing. And for the first time in many months, she felt a faint stir of purpose. That evening, she lit the candle in the shop's window and sat by the hearth with a cup of chamomile tea. She was strong. People had told her that her whole life, but strength was no shield against loss. Without Thomas, she felt as though she'd lost not only her husband, but the map of her own life. Meg turned the teacup slowly in her hands, staring into the small flame flickering on the windowsill. Perhaps, she murmured to herself, there's still a way to begin again. The house smelled of lavender, beeswax, and dust. Meg pushed open the door leading from the apothecary shop into the narrow hallway beyond. The air was still and heavy, as though Aunt Martha's presence lingered in the walls, and the worn carpets, and the faintly floral scent clinging to the drapes. She set her valise on the hallway bench and let out a slow breath. This was her home now. The living quarters above the shop were small but warm. A low-ceilinged sitting room with faded rose wallpaper and a stone hearth stood at the heart of the house. Wicker baskets brimming with dried herbs hung from the beams overhead, their colors muted by time. A pair of lace curtains fluttered faintly at the window as a winter breeze slipped through the wooden panes. The kitchen smelled faintly of rosemary and old wood smoke. Rows of chipped china lined the cupboards, and a kettle rested on the iron stove as though waiting for Aunt Martha to return and put it on. Meg trailed her fingers over the oak table, noting the faint scratches and stains left by years of use. There was no sound but the steady tick of the clock on the mantel. She spent the first morning dusting shelves and sweeping corners. Everywhere she looked, there were reminders of her aunt's steady hands. The pile of folded linen napkins, jars of dried thyme stacked in neat rows, bundles of lavender tied with twine and left to dry near the window. Meg had always admired Martha, her quiet strength, her sure knowledge of roots and herbs, but standing in her place now, Meg felt small and uncertain. She found herself lingering in the shop more than she'd planned. The apothecary itself was a wonder. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with glass jars, each carefully labeled in Aunt Martha's hands. Chamomile for restless sleep, yarrow to staunch bleeding, valerian to soothe anxious hearts. Meg traced the labels with a fingertip, wondering how a few crushed leaves or drops of tincture could possibly change the course of someone's life. They hadn't saved Thomas. And if they hadn't been enough for him, how could she offer them to anyone else? On the second afternoon, the bell above the shop door jingled softly. Meg turned sharply, her hands still dusted with flour from polishing the counter. An older woman stood framed in the doorway, her cheeks pink from the cold. She carried herself with the easy grace of someone long familiar with the shop. "Ah," she said warmly, "you must be Margaret Hale." "Yes," Meg said, brushing her hands on her apron, "though most people just call me Meg." "I'm Eliza Merrick," the woman said, stepping aside. "Your aunt and I were dear friends." Meg offered a faint smile. "I'm afraid I've much to learn before I can be of any real use here." "Nonsense," Eliza said gently, setting down her basket. "The shop has waited for you, And Martha's work isn't lost, it's here, in every jar and drawer. She pulled a small bundle of rosemary from her basket and handed it to Meg. "Hang this near the door," she said. "It'll bring protection and a sense of home." As Meg tied the rosemary above the threshold, she felt a faint flicker of comfort. Over the next days, Eliza visited often. She taught Meg how to brew chamomile tea properly, not too hot or it'll lose its calming oil, and how to recognize fresh thyme from stale. Crush a leaf between your fingers. The scent will tell you all you need to know. Meg listened and practiced, but doubt lingered in her chest like a stone. She had watched over Thomas day and night as he burned with fever. She had crushed herbs, steeped teas, whispered prayers. Nothing had saved him, and now she was expected to offer these same remedies to others, neighbors and strangers alike, and believe they might do some good. Late one evening, Meg lit a candle in the shop's bay window and watched the flame flicker against the glass. The snow outside fell softly, muting the sound of horse hooves in the square. And the reflection, she caught her own face, pale, tired, with strands of chestnut hair escaping her braid. Her gray eyes looked older than 27. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered to the empty shop. But the candle burned steady in the window, its glow spilling out onto the square. The next morning, she found a scrap of parchment on the counter, one she hadn't noticed before. In her aunt's hand were written just 5 words: "Begin where you are, Meg." The bell above the shop door jingled, breaking the hush of the afternoon. Meg looked up from her place behind the counter where she had been thumbing absently through her aunt's ledger. A woman stood in the doorway, stamping snow from her boots. She was about Meg's age, with a round face, rosy cheeks, and an air of mild impatience about her. "Afternoon," the woman said briskly. "Are you the new apothecary?" Meg straightened slightly, smoothing her apron. "Well, yes, I suppose I am." The woman glanced around the shop. "Name's Harriet Cooper. My boy's been coughing something awful these past 2 nights. I came for Martha's thyme and licorice root tea. She always kept some on hand for winter's fevers." Meg's mouth went dry. She had read about thyme and licorice root in her aunt's notes. Thyme for its antiseptic properties, licorice root for soothing a sore throat. Together, they made a simple yet effective treatment for coughs. It wasn't complicated, but her hands hesitated as she reached for the glass jars. She could still see Thomas laying pale and shivering in their bed, the bowl of cooling herb tea untouched on the nightstand. If the remedies hadn't been enough for him, how could they possibly help Harriet Cooper's child? "Are you sure it's only a cough?" Meg asked softly. The woman frowned. "Of course, he's eating fine, just restless and sputtering through the night." Martha's brew always settled him before. Meg set the jars gently on the counter. She measured the dried thyme carefully, though her fingers felt clumsy and unsure. The licorice root snapped faintly as she cut a few pieces from the gnarled root. Her voice was quieter than she intended when she spoke. "Steep these together in boiling water for 10 minutes. Let him sip it warm with honey, if he'll take it." Harriet nodded approvingly. "That's the one. Knew Martha would have shown you her ways before she passed." Meg forced a small smile. Yes, she left excellent notes. The lie tasted strange on her tongue, but she couldn't bring herself to confess that she had no real experience, only a trembling faith in the words on yellowed paper. Harriet placed a few coins on the counter and gathered the packet of herbs. "Thank you, Miss Hale. I hope you settle in well here. Bellewood may be small, but folks will keep you busy." Meg nodded politely as the door swung shut and the bell jingled again. The shop was quiet once more. Meg laid out a deep sigh and sank into the stool behind the counter. Her hands still smelled faintly of thyme, warm, sharp, alive. For a moment, she felt something stir in her chest. Not pride, not confidence, but a faint flicker of hope. And then the doubt swept in like a draft under the door. What if she had gotten the mixture wrong? What if Harriet's son worsened because of her inexperience? Meg buried her face in her hands, pressing her palms to her eyes until stars burst in the dark. You couldn't save Thomas. What makes you think you can save anyone else? The thought whispered through her mind like smoke. That evening, as she lit the candle in the shop window, she whispered into the quiet, I don't know if I belong here. The flame danced gently in the glass, offering no answer. But outside, in the square, the lanterns began to glow, one by one, as if Bellewood itself was reminding her, begin where you are. The candle in the shop window burned low as Meg sat at the oak counter, a thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. The ledger lay open before her, filled with Aunt Martha's careful, looping script. Comfrey for bruises, thyme for coughs, chamomile for restless hearts. Meg traced the ink with her fingertip, remembering the last time she'd seen Martha just over a year ago. Martha Ashford had always been a singular woman. She never married. Why tether myself when the whole world is brimming with remedies and questions, she used to say, her sharp eyes flashing with amusement. She lived alone above the apothecary for 40 years, tending her jars and her customers with the same meticulous care. People in Bellewood said she knew more about plants and their hidden virtues than any doctor in the county. Eccentric, some whispered. Brilliant, others said. Meg had loved her fiercely. As a child, Meg would spend long summer weeks in Bellewood while her parents traveled abroad. Martha's house always smelled of lavender and linseed oil, and her kitchen table was perpetually strewn with dried petals and crumbling leaves. It was Martha who taught her to recognize lemon balm by the scent, to crush mint leaves between her palms to release their oils, to stir honey clockwise so it wouldn't crystallize too quickly. Pay attention to the small things, Meg, Martha would say, tying back her graying hair with a scrap of muslin. Most people don't bother, but that's where the world keeps its secrets. Meg adored her. And yet, when she grew older and married Thomas, the visits grew fewer. Life seemed too full, too busy, to make the journey to Bellewood. Meg had written to Martha after Thomas died, or tried to. The letter sat half-finished on her desk drawer for weeks, her pen poised above the paper as she tried to explain how the light had gone out of her world. By the time she found the words, it was too late. The lawyer's letter arrived on a spring, cold morning. Miss Hale, I regret to inform you of the passing of Miss Martha Ashford of Bellewood. She left among her effects a personal note addressed to you, which I enclose here. The note was written in Martha's familiar hand, though the ink wavered in places as though the pen had trembled. My dearest Meg, if you are reading this, it means I have gone on ahead. Grief, I know, has left you hollow, and perhaps you feel as though the world holds no more place for you. But I believe otherwise. The shop is yours now, not because I expect you to become an apothecary, but because I know what it is to need something to tend when your heart has been shattered. Let the walls and windows hold you until you remember your own strength. Bellewood has a way of mending what the world unravels. Begin where you are, my girl. The rest will come in time. With all my love, Martha. Meg folded the note carefully now, smoothing the creases with her palms. She hadn't cried when Thomas died. Her grief had been too vast, too suffocating for years. But sitting in the stillness of the shop, Martha's words glowing faintly in the candlelight, the first tear slipped silently down her cheek. For the first time in months, she let herself grieve not only for Thomas, but for Martha also. The loss felt different, quieter, edged with guilt for not visiting more often, for not saying goodbye. But beneath the ache, there was a faint warmth. Martha hadn't left her alone in the world. She had left her Bellewood. The next morning, Meg opened all the shutters to let the pale winter sunlight in. The air smelled faintly of rosemary and beeswax. As she tied her apron and swept the floor, she whispered softly to the empty shop, "All right, Aunt Martha, I'll try." And though the shop was quiet, it seemed to hum faintly with approval.